7 key stages and timelines before an avoidant returns. You need to understand something fundamental about avoidant attachment. The avoidance isn't just of you, it's of themselves. It's the avoidance of vulnerability, of discomfort, of emotional accountability. And so when a relationship ends, it doesn't immediately feel like loss to them. It feels like relief. It feels like space. But that's only the first stage. When an avoidantly attached individual ends a relationship or distances themselves emotionally, the initial response is not what most people expect. Rather than grief or regret, the avoidant often experiences a sense of relief, a release from emotional pressure that felt overwhelming. This relief is not evidence of indifference or lack of connection. It is instead a product of their nervous system seeking regulation through detachment. It's not that they didn't care, it's that caring was too emotionally taxing, and the only way they knew to cope was to shut down. Avoidants often grow up in environments where emotional needs were met with inconsistency, rejection, or punishment. Vulnerability to them became associated with discomfort or even danger, so they developed a survival strategy: suppress emotion, retreat into independence, and avoid anything that feels too intimate. In a relationship, especially one with a partner who is emotionally expressive or anxiously attached, this strategy gets triggered constantly. The more closeness and connection that is offered, the more they feel trapped, suffocated, or at risk of being overwhelmed. When they finally withdraw, whether by breaking up or emotionally shutting down, it's as if a valve has been released. The pressure that had been building is gone. The emotional demands are no longer present. They can breathe again. But this breath is shallow and temporary. It is the kind of relief you feel not because something was resolved, but because something painful was suppressed. And make no mistake, suppression is not healing. It's avoidance disguised as control. In this initial phase, the avoidant may seem fine. They may appear composed, rational, even optimistic. They'll tell themselves, and often others, that this was the right choice, that they needed space, that things were becoming too much. They'll intellectualize the separation, breaking it down into logic and justifications, not because they don't feel, but because they don't know how to feel in a safe, integrated way. And so they bypass the grief entirely by numbing it. What's important to understand here is that this shutdown is not sustainable. The nervous system can only suppress for so long before emotional echoes start to emerge. But in this early stage, the avoidant is in full emotional shutdown mode. They are not reminiscing about the good times. They are not missing their ex in the way the ex might be missing them. Instead, they are leaning into their old coping mechanism, disconnecting emotionally to protect themselves. Ironically, this is often the most misinterpreted phase by the person left behind. The partner sees the avoidance relief and calm as proof that the connection meant nothing, but in reality, it's just the opening act in a longer emotional process. The avoidant may feel safe now, but the emotions they've buried, attachment, regret, longing, and in time when the silence grows too loud and the absence begins to ache, those suppressed feelings will resurface, often in unexpected and uncontrollable ways. After the initial relief that follows emotional shutdown, the avoidant often enters a phase that feels, on the surface, like liberation. This is the false sense of freedom. It's the deceptive calm that sets in once the immediate emotional tension has been removed. There's no longer a partner asking for closeness, no more difficult conversations about feelings, no perceived pressure to be emotionally available. The avoidant ex might even feel energized, reinvigorated by the illusion that they've reclaimed autonomy. They tell themselves they made the right decision, that they're finally free to be who they are without having to answer to anyone. But beneath this surface-level freedom lies avoidance, repression, and emotional denial. This phase is seductive for the avoidant. It confirms the story they've been telling themselves all along, that intimacy restricts their identity, that relationships are a threat to their independence, and that walking away is an act of self-preservation. They lean into distraction. New hobbies, work, dating, or socializing. They stay busy because stillness invites reflection, and reflection would force them to confront the deeper truth, that freedom without intimacy is often just loneliness in disguise. The avoidant isn't intentionally manipulative or heartless in this stage. They are instead operating from a deeply ingrained belief system, one shaped by early attachment wounds that taught them connection equals pain. So when they leave a relationship and step into this newfound freedom, they often feel as if they've escaped a trap. But the trap wasn't the partner, it was their own fear of emotional exposure. During this phase, the avoidant may even come across as happy. They might post more on social media, seem upbeat in public, or speak confidently about moving on. But this is performance, not peace. It is emotional disassociation masquerading as empowerment. They are not free from the relationship. They are simply running from the parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. And while they may appear to have moved on, the truth is they have not yet even begun to process the loss. Their mind may be silent, but their body has stored every moment of emotional intensity. And it will speak eventually, through dreams, memories, or sudden pangs of sadness they can't explain. This is why the freedom is false. It is a temporary high that avoids, rather than resolves, the deeper emotional dynamics at play. They haven't truly released the relationship. They've simply distanced themselves from the discomfort of feeling it. And because avoidance is a loop, not a resolution, that emotional weight will begin to circle back. Eventually, the distractions will lose their power, the new relationships will feel hollow, the excitement of freedom will fade into a quiet restlessness. And when it does, the avoidant will be left face to face with the reality they tried to escape. They didn't actually want to be alone, they just didn't know how to be close. And in that realization, the true emotional reckoning begins. After the initial relief and the seductive illusion of freedom, something begins to shift within the avoidant psyche. Quietly, subtly, and almost without warning, this is the stage of emotional echoes and memory triggers. It is not a voluntary process. The avoidant does not sit down and decide to reflect. In fact, they try to avoid it at all costs. But the nervous system doesn't forget what the mind tries to bury. Emotional experiences, especially those charged with vulnerability and attachment, leave traces, neurological imprints, sensory memories, emotional residues that don't fade simply because the relationship ended. A certain song plays unexpectedly while driving, a familiar scent in a crowded room, a restaurant they once visited with you. These seemingly minor events trigger something dormant, an involuntary emotional response, an ache, a pause, a sudden flood of memories. This is when the avoidant begins to feel the cracks forming in their emotional armor. Not in an overwhelming way at first, but in fragments. This is the stage where avoidance begins to lose its grip. Because the avoidant doesn't process emotions in real time, because their instinct is to detach, to suppress, to intellectualize, they are often blindsided by these emotional echoes. They believed they were free, they believed the connection was severed, but the human mind, particularly one wired for attachment, doesn't operate on logic alone. It stores meaning, and every moment of emotional closeness with you, every laugh, every argument, every vulnerable conversation becomes part of an internal archive they never consented to build. In this stage, the avoidant may begin to experience emotional dissonance. On one hand, they're trying to maintain the illusion of control, independence, and detachment. On the other hand, these involuntary memories keep surfacing, challenging that narrative, destabilizing their emotional certainty. They might find themselves dreaming about you, revisiting old texts or photos, or even stalking your social media in secret, not because they want to re-engage, but because they're trying to make sense of the emotional residue they thought they left behind. It's important to understand that these memory triggers do not immediately lead to action. The avoidant may not reach out, confess anything, or show signs of return. That's not how they function. Instead, they withdraw even further, confused and uncomfortable with their own emotional response. They may tell themselves, "This is just nostalgia," or "I'm just bored." But beneath that rationalization lies something deeper, the slow unraveling of emotional suppression. This stage marks the beginning of internal conflict. Their carefully constructed walls begin to echo with your voice. The silence they once craved becomes uncomfortable, and though they may still try to resist it, they start to realize they didn't really forget you. They just locked you in a room inside their mind, and now, no matter how far they run, they hear you knocking. This is the first true sign that detachment is failing, not because they've decided to care, but because they never truly stopped. The irony of the avoidant attachment style is that silence, which was once their sanctuary, eventually becomes the source of their anxiety. In the early stages of separation, silence is the safe zone. It is where they retreat to avoid the emotional overwhelm that intimacy often brings. But over time, that silence begins to speak. It becomes louder than words, louder than presence, louder than any conversation they tried to avoid. This is the phase where anxiety begins to creep in through the very silence they once used to protect themselves. At first, the absence of communication feels like a relief. There's no pressure to perform emotionally, no fear of disappointing someone's expectations, no risk of vulnerability. But silence has a way of turning on the avoidant, because silence is not emptiness, it is a mirror. And what it reflects is the unresolved tension they carry within themselves. Over time, the questions they never answered, the feelings they never faced, and the moments they shut down all begin to surface, not through conversation, but through internal unrest. This silence creates a vacuum, and the mind hates a vacuum, so it starts to fill it with thoughts, projections, and fantasies. The avoidant begins to wonder, what is their ex thinking? Have they moved on? Are they waiting, or are they gone for good? These questions fester quietly, often beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The avoidant may still act distant, calm, and self-assured on the outside, but inside, the silence is no longer peaceful. It's restless. It's uncertain. And worst of all, it's filled with the fear of losing something they thought they didn't need. What's particularly destabilizing for the avoidant in this phase is the realization that the silence is no longer in their control. In the past, they used silence as a way to regulate emotional space, to create distance, to regain autonomy. But now, the same silence begins to feel like abandonment. They may not admit it even to themselves, but they begin to feel the shift in emotional power. The person they pushed away is no longer reaching out. No more texts, no more emotional availability, no more evidence that they're still wanted, and that to the avoidant is terrifying. This anxiety doesn't erupt dramatically, it simmers. It shows up in the form of distraction, irritability, restlessness, or sudden nostalgia. They might try to quiet it with logic, saying things like, "This is for the best," or "I'm better off alone." But the body tells the truth. Their nervous system begins to register what the mind tries to deny, that emotional disconnection does not mean emotional resolution. Eventually, the avoidant is left in a state of emotional tension, torn between the need for distance and the growing anxiety that their silence may have created irreversible consequences. They begin to understand, often too late, that silence isn't neutral. It communicates. It signals withdrawal, indifference, or finality. And now, without meaning to, they've started to fear the very silence they once clung to. As the silence stretches on and the emotional dusk begins to settle, something strange happens within the mind of the avoidant. Curiosity awakens. This curiosity is not purely intellectual, it is emotional, subconscious, and driven by an uncomfortable truth. The person they distance themselves from is no longer trying to reach them. The attention they once resented is gone, and now the avoidant finds themselves wondering, not in control, but caught in the magnetic pull of questions they can't quite answer. Where are you now? Are you thinking of them? Have you moved on? Or are you still waiting? These questions give rise to a psychological loop that can evolve into full-fledged reconnection fantasies. This curiosity is not always conscious. Often it manifests subtly at first. They find themselves checking your social media without liking anything. They reread old texts and scroll through pictures they swore they deleted. A familiar song plays and suddenly they're back in a memory they didn't even realize they valued. These are not random occurrences, they are emotional breadcrumbs left behind by the connection they tried to deny. Each memory, each emotional echo challenges their narrative of detachment. Avoidants are deeply protective of their emotional independence. They fear engulfment, vulnerability, and the perceived loss of control that comes with intimacy. But once no contact has stripped them of that dynamic, once they are no longer being pursued or emotionally engaged, something shifts internally. Curiosity becomes a way for the avoidant to maintain a sense of control while still touching the connection from a distance. It's a compromise their nervous system can handle. Think about the person, but don't talk to them. Watch from afar, but don't reach out. Fantasize about reconnection, but don't take the risk of actually making contact. These fantasies are fueled by emotional ambiguity. The avoidant begins to remember the relationship not for its intensity, but for its subtleties. The way you looked at them when they were vulnerable. The way you laughed at things they didn't find funny until you laughed first. The comfort of your presence. These aren't just memories, they are emotional anchors that challenge the avoidant's belief that they are better off alone. And because they never fully process the relationship, these fantasies become a safe space to explore what they couldn't handle in real time. Ironically, the same defense mechanisms that pushed you away now keep them from acting. They may long for reconnection but fear the consequences of vulnerability, so they stay stuck, oscillating between the comfort of distance and the torment of emotional craving. The more they fantasize, the more real the connection becomes again in their mind. But without the courage to act on these feelings, they remain paralyzed. Curiosity in this stage is not harmless. It opens the door to unresolved emotion. And once that door is open, the avoidant can no longer pretend they've moved on. They may still remain silent, but internally, the fantasy of reconnection becomes a powerful force, pulling them back to a bond they once believed they could live without. Eventually, if the emotional storm brews long enough and the silence becomes too loud to bear, the avoidant may reach a critical stage, the tentative reaching out. This is not a grand gesture, it is not a dramatic apology or a sweeping declaration of love. No, it is subtle, often ambiguous, and deliberately low risk. It might look like a random meme sent at midnight, a short, "Hey, how've you been?" message, or a reaction to a story on social media. On the surface, it seems casual, almost accidental, but underneath, it's a psychological probe. It's the avoided testing the emotional waters, checking to see if the door is still open without having to walk through it just yet. This reaching out is tentative because it is filled with uncertainty. The avoidant is battling two opposing forces within themselves, the fear of vulnerability and the pull of emotional connection. They want reassurance without exposing themselves. They want closeness without commitment. They want to know you're still there, still accessible, but they don't yet have the emotional capacity to meet you in the depth they once avoided. This creates a strange paradox, reaching out while remaining emotionally guarded, inviting contact while fearing its implications. What makes this stage so psychologically complex is that it often confuses both people. For the avoidant, the act of reaching out may feel terrifying. It's an emotional risk, even if disguised as casual small talk. They don't want to be rejected, but they also fear being drawn back into a dynamic they once found overwhelming. For the person on the receiving end, this contact can feel like a mixed signal. Is it genuine interest? Is it boredom? Is it guilt? The ambiguity is deliberate, because clarity would require the avoidant to fully own their emotions, and that is precisely what they've been avoiding all along. In truth, this stage is less about reconnection and more about regulation. The avoidant is trying to soothe their internal discomfort, the anxiety that came from no contact, the obsession sparked by memory triggers, the longing masked as curiosity. Reaching out becomes a way to settle that internal storm, even momentarily. It's a bid for emotional balance, not necessarily for resolution. but it is also a door, a potential beginning. If met with warmth and emotional safety, the avoidant may begin to open up further. Not all at once and not without setbacks, but slowly, carefully, and with resistance, they may start to re-engage. However, if they are met with hostility, demands, or intense emotional pressure, they are likely to retreat again, reaffirming their fear that vulnerability leads to pain. The tentative reach out is not a resolution. It is an inflection point, a test of the emotional climate, and while it may not look like much, it represents a profound shift. The avoidant is no longer able to stay entirely detached. Something inside them, some echo of connection, some flicker of unfinished emotion, has compelled them to break the silence, even if only by a thread. And that in itself is a crack in the wall they once swore would never fall.